Brother Mark Teske's outline or lecture last night, and I can commend it to you highly. If you don't have a book, you need to purchase one and make sure you read every word that's in it. Brother Mark Teske, I graduated from Brown Trail School of Preaching in 1972, and Mark came behind me 30 years later. Does that scare you or not? It's not that Mark is getting old, it's just that I look extremely young for my age. Mark is married to Michelle for 30 years now. They have 5 grown children. Now this is his words, one amazing grandson. And he asked me when we were coming in, are you going to tell him about my grandson? I said, do we have the time to do that? He has an accounting degree from the University of New Orleans, and he also worked as a CPA. He worked in hospital administration before attending preaching school. He's a 2003 graduate of the Brown Trail School of Preaching. He did local work in Kentucky for 2.5 years. He was the executive director of the Truth and Love television program for 7 years. That is overseen by Brown Trail, is it not? And was located in Texas during that time. He's now the Director of Operations and Programming at GBN for the past 6 years. He's preached in 18 different states, 3 foreign countries, and he presently serves as an elder at the South Haven Church of Christ in South Haven, Mississippi. And today he's going to be speaking to us on purity in desires. Give him your attention if you would. Brother Mark.
I do appreciate my brother Tom. We do share several things in common, including a congregation back in Texas where he preached before coming here to Memphis. That congregation is very near and dear to both of our hearts. When I was given this assignment, Purity in Desires, looking at Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 and 28, that's when the nerves started. This is one of those subjects that preachers don't necessarily like having to preach about, but it is the part of the whole counsel of God and something that we must truly speak about. Purity in our sexual desires. And as we begin, I think it's rather obvious by the subject that this is a mature subject in some ways. I'm going to do my best to treat things delicately, but we need to deal with things truthfully. And I appreciate Tom's comments about the manuscript. Tried to be very forthcoming in the words there in the manuscript, so we can be a little bit more delicate as we deal with the subject here from the pulpit. And as we begin trying to understand the desires and the heart, one thing I'd like to do by way of introduction is make sure that we have a proper understanding of the way God views the heart, has always viewed the heart. You know, some people have made the claim, well, the God of the Old Testament was totally different than the God of the New Testament. The God of the Old Testament cared about certain things, but the New Testament, he cares about things totally different. That Jesus, his teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, as profound as it was and still is to this day, did not represent a significant departure in doctrine. The things that he taught were consistent with what the Old Testament taught all along. For instance, the law always required our love for God, Deuteronomy 6, verse 5. Always required love for our neighbors, Leviticus 19, verse 18. Sacrificial giving from the heart, Exodus 25, verse 2. Protecting our heart from covetousness, Exodus 18, verse 21, and chapter 20, verse 17. Worship was required to come from the heart, Isaiah chapter 29, verse 13. And our meditations of the heart were to be acceptable to him as well. Psalm 19, verse 14. So we can see a lot of these concepts that we see in the New Testament are merely restatements of things that we had in the Old. The heart has always been the key to our obedience to God's law, Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 29. And it's also, the heart is the source of our disobedience, as we learn in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 16. So as we put this together, we can see that the heart is something that God has always been concerned about. So when we get to Matthew chapter 5, beginning verse 27, we read, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Clearly, Jesus knew what he was speaking about. And if you step back and think about it, he's really restating part of the 10th commandment, is he not? You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. He's dealing with this same subject and merely stating it in a way that maybe wakes us up a little bit, as we hadn't been, or the Jews hadn't been, by the Old Testament law. This is consistent with teaching we see elsewhere in Scripture as well. For instance, chapter 15, beginning in verse 19. Out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witnesses, blasphemies. These are the things which defile a man. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a man. God has always cared about our heart, the things that we desire, the things that we're longing for, these things that are inside of us. And what he's teaching here in Matthew chapter 15 and elsewhere, it begins within the heart, and the manifestation of that is oftentimes the sins that other people see. However, that state of the internal heart is in and of itself a sin. That lustful desire, if it's targeted in the wrong direction, that sexual desire is something that can itself be sinful. As we begin talking about this subject, we look at sexuality as a whole. And to be honest, it's one of the most troublesome areas for people in obedience to God. This is one area that causes a lot of people great angst, great trouble. We have marriages dissolving. We have premarital situations. We have homosexuality. We've got trouble and difficulties all around us continually. Sometimes makes you wonder, why did God put this here for us anyways? You know, wouldn't this world be a whole lot less complicated if we didn't have this to worry about? Wouldn't life be that much easier if we didn't have these problems around us? Absolutely, but the problem is not with God's design. His design is beautiful. At Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, it's not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him. I'm going to make that companion for him, that wife for him. And the Hebrews writer said in Hebrews 13, verse 4, marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled, but fornicators and adulterers God will judge. There is beauty in the relationship that God has designed for husband and wife. The book, The Song of Solomon, filled with the poetic manifestation of that relationship, husband and wife. This is the way God designed us. And there's an illustration that you'll find in the manuscript that as we talk about this subject, really, to me, it brings a whole lot of meaning. You see, back when I preached in Kentucky, our family had a small farm, about 3 acres. We kept some chickens and turkeys, and my wife decided she wanted some geese. These were the birds that she wanted for herself. So we ordered 4 geese, and they came in, and she spent the most of that week playing with those geese. The little goslings, they're cute, they're fun, and she was with them continually. Well, do you know what those geese did? They imprinted on her. And because of that relationship that she had with those little goslings as they were growing up, they saw her as Mama Goose. And in their eyes, she was the world. As soon as she walked out the back door, they were right there to walk behind her. She's going out to get the food, and they're right behind her. Anybody that they think is going to attack her, they will attack them. Now, my kids will be quick to tell you, they didn't imprint on the kids. They had been more than several occasions been goosed by a goose. And there's a reason why that is named that way. Because the geese would come after them, come after anybody. Somebody they didn't recognize, pull up in the driveway, what are they doing? They're better than watchdogs. But that imprinting that they have, to this day, if those geese were still alive, if they saw my wife, they would fall right into that pattern. Because there was an imprinting, there was that bond that was developed between her and those goslings. And that's God's design for marriage. A husband and a wife together. And the sexual relationship binds the two together like the mortar between the bricks. And it hardens and it secures and it keeps those two together as God designed. It's almost as though we become addicted to our spouse. And I'm using that phrase purposely. That's the way God designed us. That I become addicted to my wife becomes addicted to me, and this whole aspect of our being has an exclusivity for each other. And that exclusivity, that bonding us together, brings that relationship closer than any other human relationship we can have. Matter of fact, there's some body chemistry that's a part of that. Some of the hormones that we have bring us closer together and bond us like we should be. Also, as we look at God's plan for the marriage relationship, there's one word that stands out so clearly: the love that a husband and wife should have for each other. The same love that we should have for all. And that's agape love. That love that says, I want what is in your best interest. It's a decision love. I want what's best for you. And when I have that type of love for my spouse, my focus is going to be on her. What does she need? What would be best for her? And that relationship works together. When I have truly that agape love for my spouse, the sexual relationship is no longer focused on what can I get, but it's now what can I give? How can I give to her? How can I bless her? And that's the way the relationship should be. Our relationship, our marriage relationship, should not be about what's in it for me. It's a special relationship whereby I can bless her and I can spoil her better than anyone else in the world. That's the essence of marriage. It's not about me. Of course, when we see deviations from God's plan, fornications and adulteries, that is the exact opposite of agape love, is it not? It's not what I can do for you, what I can give to you. It's what's in it for me. My pleasure, my desires then become the driving force. And as we look at Scripture and see all the places where these type of sins are discussed, we see it happening continually. This is a major area of focus when we get to the practical sections of Scripture. That passage in 1 Corinthians 6, beginning in verse 9, the list, and please bear with me, I mean no disrespect when I call these laundry lists, but when you have one thing after another, lists of sins, I just refer to them as laundry lists, no disrespect intended at all. But in 1 Corinthians 6, this laundry list, do not be deceived. Neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor homosexuals, nor sodomites, and the list goes on and on. 40% of that list, 40% deals with sexual sins. Galatians chapter 5, verse 19. Now the works of the flesh are evident, which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness. First 4, all dealing with sexual sins. 1 Timothy 1:10, fornicators, sodomites, kidnappers, liars, perjurers, any other thing contrary to sound doctrine. You see how these sins show up in so many of these lists. Why is that? Because the problem is indeed so prevalent. When we look at deviations from the pattern, we can see what God designed for us, that bonding of the husband and wife to each other. When that bonding happens in a place that it shouldn't, trouble ensues. Going back to our text, Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 and 28, looking at a woman for the purpose of lusting after her. We've got a problem. We've got a sin. And there is a difference between temptation and actually having the sin in and of itself. And I'll admit, as we try to talk about this, there appears to be a fine line between the two. But Matthew chapter 5 says, this is the intent. This is why I am looking. The world we live in, sometimes there's things that we see that, frankly, I'd like to unsee. That's the world we live in. Is seeing something that you want to unsee a sin? No. But when you stop wanting to unsee that, that's where sin takes hold. When you look at something for the purpose of developing that lust for that person. When we deviate from His plan, when we deviate from the way God designed us, we bring within us troubles and problems. And the same thing that works to our advantage when the exclusive object of our desire is our spouse, when there is not that exclusivity, it messes things up. It creates deep-seated problems because that bonding is going to take place. You know, those goslings followed my wife. If she wasn't there, if that was really a mama goose, they would have bonded to her. Gonna bond to something. That sexual relationship is going to bond you to something. The question is, what is it going to bond you to? God's design is it bonds you to your spouse. But oftentimes that doesn't happen. The bonding takes place with an illicit desire for another, pornography, homosexuality, and other perversions. That bonding takes place there. You know, oftentimes pornography is called an addiction. How does it get to the level of an addiction? This is the process we're talking about. You're not bonding with your spouse, you're bonding with pictures, with videos, with stories, whatever it is. Bonding to the wrong thing. And it creates problems. Back before I got into preaching, I was in the hospital business. And one of the hospitals in the company that I worked with had a sexual offender treatment program for juvenile sex offenders. Let me tell you, that was difficult. The success rate, this was back in the early 90s, we got the success rate into the double digits. And that was earth-shattering. Somebody so young who's engaged in deviant behavior is getting that connection, that bond to something that is wrong as wrong can be. And it is hard to break. These bonds are incredibly strong. But they're not impossible to break. Do not be deceived. That passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, beginning in verse 9. All those sins that were discussed. And how does that passage end in verse 11? And such were some of you. Past tense. This is the way you were, not the way you are. These sins can be overcome. Absolutely so. Is it difficult? More difficult than most. But it can be done. And there are good brethren who are volunteer their services to help fellow Christians overcome some of these sins. It's a very difficult road. I'm not going to argue that. But it can happen. There is not a sin that we can get involved in that cannot be cured by the gospel. There is no sin that you are involved in that you cannot overcome. To deny such is to deny the power of the cross. So how do we prevent problems? How do we keep these things from our lives? Well, we need to realize the difference between temptation and sin and draw a clear line. I will not make a decision to seek this out. There's some things that, like we said before, are inevitable. Be bothered by that. Continue to be bothered by that. Continue to allow that to upset you, to offend you. In our world today, there's so many things people get offended over. Some of them you just want to shake your head. Be offended by this. Realize it for what it is, an attack against your marriage. In the broadcasting business, there is a term that we use, signal to noise ratio. How strong is the signal? How loud is the noise around it? The signal being what it is you want to be focused on. So for instance, in an auditorium like this, the signal would be the sound of the speaker's voice. The noise is the noise going around in the room. And if there's a couple dozen babies that are a little bit cranky that particular day, what happens to the noise level in the room? It goes up. And how about listening to the speaker? You maybe got to do a little of this. Make sure you can hear. Or maybe you've got a sound guy who's on top of things. He's turned up the volume just a little bit. Make it easier to hear. Sound, the signal to noise. So you can focus on what's most important. And you can drown out that noise, that clutter that just gets in the way. Now let's make application to our subject here. What's the signal? The signal is my wife. That signal needs to be loud and clear, and my signal to her needs to be loud and clear. Because I got to tell you, the world we live in is a noisy place. There's a lot of distractions. There's a lot of things that are focusing for our attention. What do advertisers say? Sex sells. Trying to appeal to that part of our consciousness. And we need to be vigilant to fight this continually. Strengthen the signal, reduce the noise. And that's something that I think will help us and allow us, using that agape love, to help our spouse that much better. Another thing that we need to do to prevent this problem in our life is erect multiple barriers. Multiple barriers. Every step of the way, put a barrier in place. Job 31 verse 1. I've made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a young woman? Job's words. I've made a covenant with my, not just an agreement. He said a covenant. I am determined not to look upon a woman. Focusing his attention where it needs to be. Getting rid of the noise. That's a barrier that he erected. That's a barrier that each and every one of us should erect for ourselves. My eyes, what do I see? The next barrier, not to overstep my bounds and get into BJ's subject for tomorrow, but the things coming out of my mouth. What do I say? Do I have purity in my speech? Ephesians chapter 5, beginning in verse 3. But fornication and all uncleanness or covetousness, let it not even be named among you as is fitting for saints. Neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving of thanks. I love a joke as much as somebody else. But we need to view this subject as sacred, not a joking matter. We need to make sure that we focus our attention where it should be. You know, sometimes guys, they'll just excuse things, oh, that's just locker room talk. Where do you find that in Scripture? I don't find it. But if my speech becomes a stumbling block for my brother, shame on me. We need to make sure that we have a barrier about what we discuss. How do we talk about these things? And I realize that sometimes there's some conversations that need to be had. My wife would call it a therapeutic conversation. Even in these cases, we need to be very careful about how we deal with these subjects. There have been times in counseling sessions I've heard things that frankly I really wish I could unhear. Sometimes people talk about things I wish I didn't know about. You know, some of the most humorous people I think in the world are bomb technicians. They're the guys who have the signs on the back of their shirts that say, if you see me running, catch up. One of them one time was asked, you're dealing with bombs and putting them on planes. How do you deal with these things? He says, oh, very carefully. How do you deal with these things in conversation, even when it has to be a therapeutic conversation? Treat it like dynamite, very carefully. Understanding there could be problems, there could be temptations. And certainly, we're not going to repeat any of this outside of that private conversation. Of course not. Especially understanding that could be a distraction to another. Another barrier that we need to erect is, what do we dwell upon? What do we think about? What do we mull over in our heads? I think that's part of what Jesus was getting to in our text, Matthew 5, 27 and 28. That intent of looking at a woman for the purpose of lusting after her and dwelling upon it and spending time there, entertaining the thought. The better use of our brain, the better use of our time, our mental faculties, Philippians 4, verse 8. Finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue, if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. Spend our time thinking about these things. Hebrews 13, verse 5. Redirect. If there's an illicit thought that is trying to gain attention in my head, switch. My wife. Instead of thinking about something that's wrong, think about something that is pure, that is holy, that is special. Change the focus to where God intended it and strengthen that mortar that's there with us. We also need to make sure that we erect the barrier about what gets ingrained within us, what gets there and holds on to us. Jeremiah was dealing with a situation in chapter 6, verse 15. Were they ashamed when they had committed abomination? No, they were not at all ashamed, nor did they know how to blush. Therefore, they shall fall among those who fall. Do you blush? Do you blush? Does it bother you when you see something inappropriate? Does it make you uncomfortable? I hope and pray that we've all erected that barrier, that it causes us great discomfort when such has happened. The younger years are especially vulnerable. Proverbs chapters 5, 6, and 7. Warnings to the young man. Don't imprint yourself sexually on something inappropriate as a young man. If I may summarize those 3 excellent chapters of Scripture. What is pure? What is right? And in the world around us, there are some risk factors that the world has seen statistically in people who are studying these things. This is not the church, this is the world. But notice the risk factors that they identify. Static risk factors, those that cannot be changed through intervention, include younger age, previous sexual offenses, commission of non-contact sexual offenses and non-sexual violent offenses, offending against male victims, unrelated victims, and strangers. I hope you didn't miss that, offending against male victims. The Catholic Church, their problem with pedophilia, 75% of it is homosexual. 75%. The world is going to try to tell you, oh, there's nothing wrong with homosexuality. You just need to accept it. Absolutely not. And we see things like that to protect our children. We need to be preaching about this from the pulpits. We need to make sure our voice is loud and clear. This is an abomination. But we also need to make sure that we protect and train our boys as they're growing up. Make sure that we help them deal with this before it becomes a problem. These things right here can be amazing tools. They can be very destructive. If your son is not yet trained himself to be able to control himself, and you put one of these in his pocket, shame on you. We need to make sure that those controls are taught early on, that we don't throw our boys out in the midst of wolves. Contrary to what teenagers may tell you, I have yet to meet a 12-year-old who has died because they don't have a cell phone. And not just cell phones, computers. If you put a computer in a child's bedroom connected to the internet and something bad doesn't happen, that should be surprise. That's just begging for problems. Televisions. Put these in public areas of the home so that everybody knows what's being watched. It's not just a problem for men, it's becoming more prevalent among women as well. These problems are becoming prevalent everywhere. We need to be more vigilant than ever, brethren. We need to make sure that we focus our attention where God intended it, on our spouse, and do everything we can to bring that relationship as close together as possible. Getting that signal up high, eliminating the noise, and following God's plan for our lives. Thank you so very much for your kind attention.